Welcome back, guys. As you can probably read from the title, it is the first time that I ever organized a chess tournament. At least I was one of the people helping out there. The official title which I got was Tournament Director. And in this video, I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about what I did there and perhaps show you some nice games of that tournament. So a quick backstory. I am employed by the Austrian Chess Federation since May this year, and still am until the end of the year. And I was helping out with a couple of different things. I was doing youth trainings with our most promising young players. And now, a couple of months ago, I got asked by the General Secretary and the Austrian Chess President to organize a GM round-robin tournament for our most promising young players. And I accepted the challenge. I thought it was a very nice thing to do, especially that our most promising players are going to get a nice chance to have a strong tournament in Vienna. They don't need to travel as much. And hopefully some of them are going to have a good chance to score some norms. This is what it's all about. And I am the tournament director of that. So I put together the whole playing field. I'm going to show you the participants in just a second. And of course, I also need to mention the chief arbiter of the event, Walter Kastner, who is also the general secretary of the Austrian Chess Federation, has been so for many, many years and has done a great deal for Austrian chess overall. So let's get things started. Maybe a couple of details before we go to the playing field. So the tournament is played from the 16th of December until the 23rd. So today there is actually a double round today on Saturday. And the first round today was at 9 o'clock. And the second round is being played as we speak. And I plan to do 2 videos about this tournament. One after halftime basically now, after 5 rounds, and the other one at the end of the event. And now we see the results from round number 1 to round number 5. And especially one thing that is already becoming obvious, that a very serious contender for a norm is going to be Lukas Dotzer, who has a fantastic score of 4.5 out of 5 points. He is 15 years old, I believe, and already has one Grandmaster norm, which he achieved recently, and is definitely a very, very serious talent to watch out for. I've played him already 3 times. Probably some of you guys have seen the recaps. I have a score of 0.5 point out of 3 against him. I've always been struggling playing against him. Recently in the Austrian Bundesliga, which just concluded, I made a draw with the black pieces there, but he's definitely a very gifted and hardworking player, and it is paying off definitely now with a score of 4.5 out of 5 points. He only made 1 draw. Let me actually see in which round that was. So we can go through it from round number 1 to the very end. So to get things started, the Grandmasters in the tournament are Jan Subelj, Pechac, and Grandmaster Adam Kozak. Another thing which is amazing in this tournament is that the average age of the players is actually just 19 years old, which is unbelievable. The youngest players are, as mentioned, Lukas Dotzer and Balint, who is also my student. Both of them are 15 years old. And already both of them are very, very strong. So in the first round, what was there? Lukas Dotzer beat Valentin Baidetsky, who has been a member of the Austrian national team before. Jan Subelj won against Marius Fromm, another one of the invited players from Germany, international master. And there were some draws there. I am just thinking in which round Lukas Dotzer made a draw, because he won all of the other games. He did make a draw, in the 3rd round against Pechac. And current leader is Lukas Dotzer. As I said, I'm actually not so sure who is the other leader, if we can change the view right here. So this is the current standing after 5 rounds. Lukas Dotzer with 4.5 points, followed by Pechac with 3.5 points. Jan Subelj with a score of +1. Likewise, Balint and Valentin Baidetsky. 2 players which are struggling so far are Borrmann, another fellow chess player from Vienna, and Ernst. So now since we have some information already about the tournament in general, the location, which I haven't mentioned yet, is the House of Sport in Vienna, which is also pretty good. I think all of the players are quite happy with the conditions overall. At least I very much hope so. It's right next to the Belvedere Palace in Vienna. Generally a very nice location. A lot of embassies are nearby there too. Very central and very nice as well. So now we are heading to the chess part of this video. And I compiled a couple of memorable moments from the tournament overall so far. And I would like to start it by showing just the first few moves of the first round between Sanjin Culum, who is playing there, and Grzegorz Pechac. Pechac with the black pieces. And the game started with, first of all, quite a curious move order, e4, knight c6. Then it again transposed to a more normal theory after knight f3, e5. And after bishop b5, Pechac played queen f6. And I was there at the small opening ceremony of the tournament. I was just walking by and seeing it's already off to a good start. Players are quite creative. Pechac Grzegorz is very much known for often trying quite unorthodox openings. I think he was playing in the Prague Masters, not in the Prague Masters, but Prague Challengers a couple of years ago, and played knight h3 in the first move. For example, I think it was against Motilev, and generally he has quite a few different interesting ideas in opening. And the thing was, I'm quite sure that even with queen f6, he did prepare that. And in the game, he managed to equalize, and after a little bit of suffering, and then managed to make a draw here. I don't want to get into too much detail in that game, but just thought it was nice to point out. So the next game, which I would like to show you, is between Jan Subelj and Marius Fromm, also from the first round. And that was very interesting. It came from some English with an early h5, quite a topical line nowadays. And some insane complications started around here when black took on g3 and Jan Subelj went for f4, which is winning a piece. Black cannot do anything about that, because if the knight moves, then the bishop on g7 is going to fall. But Marius Fromm here had a very nice chance. He took on h2 with the rook, which was a mistake, because now after f takes e5, he tried sacrificing the rook for the bishop on g2, but then did not manage to find a perpetual check in this position, and his king got checkmated in the very end. So Jan Subelj managed to escape from all of the checks after a bit of time, and here there are no more checks, and therefore white is winning. But black had a very nice chance here. The move knight c6 actually holds the balance. Even white has to be a little bit careful, with the point that bishop takes g7 fails because of queen b6. And now if the king moves, then rook takes h2 is a checkmate. White's best chance is still to take d takes c6, and now rook takes h2, and still white cannot take on g7 because now queen h5. Not queen c5, which can easily be parried by bishop d4 or queen d4, but queen h5. And as it turns out, white has no counter against the threat of rook h1 check on the next move. White can take on d7 with a check, but it doesn't really matter. And on the next move, black is going to play rook h1 check, and then queen to h2 with checkmate. So white's best is still to go for e3 to cover the h5 square, so that black's queen cannot go there. But now if the bishop takes d4, e takes d4, d takes c6, it goes on a bit further, but in the end, black is going to have pretty nice compensation, already having how many pawns for the piece? 3 pawns already, if I'm counting correctly. So this is how the line went, which I had a look at. Take on h3, knight c3. And now queenside castle, and the position remains unclear. If queen g4 check, there's still queen f5, which covers the rook on h3 and parries the check on c8. So that was a nice bit, and actually a nice calculation exercise. Here knight c6 kept the balance. In the end, after rook takes h2, Jan Subelj managed to win that game. The next game, which I would like to show you, was between Robert Ernst and Adam Kozak, also from the first round. The curious thing about that was the resulting endgame. So it started off with a queen c2, b6 nimzo, Adam Kozak having the black pieces. But the endgame which came was in fact featured on my YouTube channel, just that white's pawn is already on f4. We had a look at this in the rook endgame series, where white's pawn was mostly on f2. And I did, as mentioned earlier, did have a couple of sessions with our Austrian talents. Robert Ernst was also taking part in some of them, and we did analyze those endgames together as well. Just the thing was, we analyzed them with the pawn on f2 and not with the pawn on f4, which made things a little bit more difficult, I assume, for him to defend. Adam Kozak, Grandmaster from Hungary, a good friend of mine, managed to win this endgame from the black side. And not going into too much depth here, I want to show you the crucial moments of that endgame. So Adam centralized his king, and Robert Ernst, I believe, chose the right plan here, advancing on the king side with h4. It does look like it can be a weakness, and in the end it did turn out to be so, but it's still the right approach, I believe, to start with that. Adam Kozak went for h5. I would also find it logical for black to go rook c5 here, maybe then to prepare h5 in the next move, or just to guard the 5th rank. But it turns out here, after rook a3, h5, generally white is sort of happy to take on h5 here. g5 is wrong because of king e7, and then the king could enter on the f5 square, and this becomes pretty bad for white. But this position is also going to be reached in the game, and white actually is making a draw here. Even though it looks like white has ruined the pawn structure, this is still good enough for a draw. So in the game, it's reached a similar position here. Kozak went with the king to d7, but now it quickly went into black's favor. There are a couple of things to point out here. So first of all, h5 looks like a logical move for white, just trying to exchange some pawns, but this is in fact losing, because after taking, black has rook g8, cutting off white's king on the h-file, and black is just going to slowly but surely advance his d-pawn together with the king. Another move which I was thinking about, but which I believe is very difficult to figure out on the board, is f5, and the computer does hold this with the idea of rook c4 check, and now king to h3. If king g5, it would fail because of it is connected to rook c5. But after king h3, g takes f5, h5, it turns out that white has sufficient counterplay with the h-pawn. One sample line which I had a look at here, rook c1, king h2, important not to allow a check on h1. Rook to c8, king g3, and then king h4 back, f6, rook e1. I think this is not very easy to figure out on the board. Black is up 2 pawns, but whenever the rook leaves the h-file, then white is going to advance with h6 too. So for example, like this, white can also try to support the h-pawn with the rook, and apparently this is a draw. I think the way Robert Ernst played was also very natural. Rook a3, trying to prepare checks on the queen side. Rook c1, king g5, rook c5 check, king g4 back, rook d5, check on a7, king e6, but here was the fatal mistake. Black actually has quite a big threat here, which I believe Robert Ernst has missed. He waited with rook b7, but now Adam Kozak played rook d3, and it turns out that f5 now becomes a big threat, and white already is lost here. So it was imperative for white to guard the 3rd rank with a move like rook a3, for example. And then it is still quite a big suffering process for white here, but it should be a draw. For example, if black pushes d5, white can cut off the king from the 6th rank with rook b6 check. In the game after rook b7, rook d3 was played, and then this is how it concluded. White's king is just too far away here, and also those 2 pawns are now very weak. Black is threatening to pick up h4 first, and then to take on f4. And therefore Adam Kozak won here with the black pieces. Pretty instructive endgame. Let's head on to the next moment I wanted to show you. Borrmann with the white pieces against my student Peter Balint, another very talented player from Austria. And that endgame was specifically curious. So it started out with a very modern line in the Nimzo, and after a lot of complications and mutual mistakes, the following endgame was reached here, where white is a full queen up, basically, for a bishop and rook, and white also has an extra pawn for that. But Peter Balint unleashed an amazing fortress idea here. So he started with bishop c4, and white actually, I believe, needs to be extremely precise here to be able to win this. Let's see how the game then concluded. Borrmann played queen to a8, rook f6 check, king e3 was played, rook f6 check, and then rook e6 check, king d4, and now bishop b3. And all of a sudden the bishop goes to a4, and then it becomes very difficult for white to break through on the king side here. And I was quite curious to also see if this exact position without the whole queen side is winning or not. So I just put up this position on the board, and it seems like that this is still winning here for white. Queen d4 check, for example, king g8. White can go g4. And one trick which black can try is to go h5, because taking on h5 now is a draw. This is a nice fortress for you to know. This is in fact a draw. White has no way to make progress here. Black can go back rook h6, rook e6, wait with the king, just not allow the queen to h8 here. But black shouldn't go for h5 necessarily because g5 is winning. White is then able to pick up the h5 pawn slowly with the queen. Queen d1, for example, is coming next. But what happens if black waits? Here, I believe that white's winning plan is going to be to sacrifice the queen at one point for the rook on e6. For example, here, black probably doesn't have any more squares to go to with the rook. For example, if here, then there's a double attack with queen c8 check. And after king g7, there's always this idea. But if we now see the same position with the bishop on a4, then white can never actually go for that. Like here, whenever white sacrifices the queen on e6, black still has the bishop on the queen side, and then black would probably even be winning there. So let's go step by step. So queen a8 was played in the game. I think that queen a7 is probably a little bit more precise here, because now a4 already is a big threat. And if black continues like in the game, king can go back to h2 even. And now a4 is a threat. And if white is able to make a pass pawn there, then it should be game over. If bishop b3 now, queen d4 check. And now black is not in time to put up the fortress with h6, and white is able to play h5 himself. Rook e6, queen d8 check. And here even win the b5 pawn in the very end. So black is not in time to consolidate. Even if white doesn't take on b5 here and goes, for example, h6, I still believe that this now should be winning for white if white manages to get the pawn there. But in the game, Peter Balint managed to achieve this setup with the bishop on a4, and I believe from what I briefly analyzed that the final white mistake here was to play g4. Now after h6, the computer still gives a winning advantage for white, but I couldn't find a way to break through for white, and the game then also did conclude in a draw with Peter Balint showing a very nice defense here. So this is how the game concluded. At some point, Borrmann tried g5, but still black can just continue waiting, like without the queen side here. This same position without the queen side would also be a fortress. As far as I understood, white can probably still win in a position like this if he doesn't go for g4. It was very hard to analyze, like I was trying to play around with the engine a little bit here. In practice, I'm not sure you are able to win this, but the computer always came up with some ideas to disrupt the coordination, and I don't know even what this was. I think this was one line which I've had a look at. I don't know if that made any sense here. It was just some computer analysis. But at some point, I think that the computer was able to break through. Let's see if that variation led anywhere. Yeah, for example, like with ideas like this, it was like a huge winning advantage. It was like +4 or so. It was still incredibly difficult to figure out how white's winning plan is exactly, but it seemed like to me if the pawn is already on g4, then for whatever reason it becomes more difficult for white to win. I think because in some cases there is no queen g4 check. I think that makes a difference. So for example, in this position now, if king g7, then it would run into queen e5 check, and this position will always lose because white has some winning plans. For example, now g4, g5 is probably the simplest, and black is going to lose the rook on f6. Yeah, very complicated endgame. I think you can still do a lot of analysis there if you wish to do so. I will try to keep it short here, but from what I understood, it was that Borrmann's final mistake here was to play g4. After that, it appears to me that it could be already a fortress for black. But very interesting endgame, and also cool to make some to try to work out the similarities if the queen side is there and what happens if it is not. All right, so let's have a look at the next game, which I wanted to show you. Just a brief segment between Grzegorz Pechac and Adam Kozak from round number 2, which featured an absolutely crazy sacrifice by Pechac Grzegorz, who sticks true to his style here. Here he sacrificed the whole rook by taking on d5, which objectively speaking is not at all a sound sacrifice, but he did in the end manage to trick Adam Kozak and managed to win that game with the white pieces. Kozak here went for king h8, was up a full rook, but still black lags a bit behind in development, and Pechac was then able to win that game in the end. I thought that taking on e3 and then going for king h8 here seems like the more natural move in the position. I guess if knight f4, black still has some back rank ideas here. But yeah, if your opponent plays so straightforward and so aggressive, it is always very difficult to handle that over the board. So the next game was also between Adam Kozak and, again, my student Peter Balint. which Peter Balint was was actually able to win from the black side, and that was another heavy piece endgame. Then went to a rook endgame here. Adam Kozak with the white pieces went for the rook endgame with queen to f5, which was a grave mistake. He should have gone for it with queen to e4, because now if black exchanges, then the pawn on d5 is well protected. In the game, queen f5 was played, and then after taking king f6, it was already quite difficult for white to hold here. g4, the most logical move, protecting the f5 pawn, is already the losing mistake. Computer was pointing out here that white can just leave the pawn on f5 by playing b4, and then is able to have sufficient counterplay by placing the rook to c5. I'm also not sure here, to be honest, what happens after king takes f5. Maybe white is able to just play king to f3, then g4 check, king e4, rook c5, but that's already difficult to figure out over the board, in my opinion. Still quite instructive how Peter Balint managed to win this now, after white plays the king to e4, f6. Material is still level, but the pawn on d5 is always a weakness now. Rook g8, nice prophylactic move, perhaps aimed against some h4 ideas. Kozak played b4, en passant, and now rook to a8. And black's task is going to be to remove the king to e4, after which the d5 pawn falls, after which also the c6 pawn falls. Kozak tried h4, rook a2, and h takes g5, and now you can try to find the fastest win for black here, which Peter managed to find, rook to f2. And there is no way white can stop rook f4 checkmate on the next move. So very strong victory for Peter Balint, who is, by the way, also a very big contender now for achieving a norm in this tournament. Let's head on to the next game, which I wanted to show you, featuring another rook endgame. We're continuing with that theme between Jan Subelj and Sanjin Culum, the Bosnian participant in the tournament. And Subelj was able to win this seemingly harmless rook endgame from the white side. Let's go through it to see what happened. Black played king g6, very logical. g4, probably the best try. Otherwise, if black is able to play h5 next, then there is going to be nothing happening here. g4, rook b4, and if you go a couple of moves further, Subelj just slowly improved his position. Rook to b5, and now king g7 was played, which is maybe already a little bit of a careless move. I'm not so sure about it. I would be considering maybe guarding the 7th rank here by placing the rook on a7. Still a draw here, of course, but after rook b7 check, king g6, h4, now black already needs to make a decision. h5 is now forced, because otherwise white is going to play h5 himself. And for example here, after king g5, it's going to be checkmate. So h5, and now another nice try by Subelj. He went for the move g5 here. And now black always needs to figure out if those connected passed pawn endgames are in fact a draw or not. Mostly they are, but it's already sort of an unpleasant situation to have to calculate all of that. Those positions are always a draw, even if the pawn on h5 is not there. This is kind of a famous draw with the f and with the h pawn. So in the game, Culum went for rook a6, rook b5 played, rook to c6, king f2, rook c2 check, king g3, and now rook c6 back. And now Jan tried the next idea with f4, already threatening f5 check. So now, after checking, black had to take on g5. H takes g5, the only way to keep winning chances alive. If, for example, white takes with this pawn, then there's always going to be pressure on the h4 pawn. So still everything was fine here. Black defended very well, but it's getting a bit complicated. g6, rook g3, f5, rook g5, going after the f5 pawn, which now, in fact, white needs to leave. If white just defends it slowly, then black is going to be able to find counterplay with h3. So king e3 was played, rook takes f5, and now g7. Rook e5 check. Watch out for those tricks. Rook g5 always runs into ideas with rook b5. So he gave a check, king f4, and now rook e8, going back. And after king f5, black only has one way to save the draw here, which Sanjin, unfortunately for him, did not manage to find here. He went for a very logical move, h3, which loses on the spot, because now white can play rook to f6, perhaps the move which Sanjin missed in the game. Now the whole idea is if rook g8, which was maybe his idea, fails because of rook to f8, and after rook takes g7, there's rook h8 check, followed by checkmate. In the game, rook a8 was still tried, but now rook f8, and after check, king f4, the king is just going to run back and then take the pawn. And after black continues checking, the king can just run over to the queen side, and then white is going to be able to promote at some point. So black's only chance here to save the game was to go rook g8 first, and after king f6, only now to go h3, after which black can sacrifice the rook here, and this position is going to be a draw. So we are seeing many rook endgames in this tournament so far. The last one is coming shortly, but now we're going to have a look at one of the games of the tournament leader, Lukas Dotzer, who played a fantastic game yesterday against Jan Subelj, winning with the white pieces in a very great manner. We're going to have a look at the whole game, just briefly go through the opening stage here. It was an anti-marshal with h3 here. Other moves include a4 here, which I've played at the World Cup, for example, against Yuan Yi, or of course c3, inviting the marshal gambit like this. Dotzer went for h3, now bishop b7. d3, d5, all standard theory here. Now white takes the pawn on e5 and is arguing that he has at least a different version compared to the normal marshal, where in the normal marshal, white has committed himself to going for the move c3. Knight d4 was played. Black is going to win the bishop pair here in most of those variations and is just going to play for long-term compensation with the bishop pair, and arguably so, because the bishop on b7 is always a very strong piece long-term. f6, knight g4, knight to b4, knight e3. By the way, I think that here knight b4 was not the main move by number of games. I think most players went for the move queen d7 here, if I remember correctly. But knight b4 was played by Jan Subelj here. Knight to e3, f5, restricting the knight on e3. Otherwise, knight f5 might be an idea from black. Now bishop d2, f4. And now after knight g4, black takes the chance to take on f3, forcing white to take back with the g-pawn, g takes f3, since queen takes f3 would run into knight takes c2. And after g takes f3, now black had to be really precise, which was difficult for Jan Subelj. He had to play the move h5 here, trying to kick back the knight. It's not even obvious white cannot go to e5 here, at least not immediately. I analyzed the line bishop takes b4 first, c takes b4, and now knight to e5. But now black can play for some compensation with bishop c5. Also, this seems quite difficult because white does have a pretty safe king still, and even in this line managed to run out to the e2 square. And also here white does keep a slight advantage because even rook g1 could go after black's king in the long run there. Jan Subelj went for the move knight to c6, removing the knight from the active b4 square, and this allowed Lukas Dotzer to continue with queen to e2, already trying to get into the e6 square, which already would win the knight on c6 with check. So bishop d6 was played. Now bishop to c3, which was a slight inaccuracy, and it did allow black to achieve some compensation with rook e8, which is, however, quite a difficult move because you need to understand that in this position, being two full pawns down, you have compensation because of the slightly misplaced knight on g4, which doesn't really have a great future, and black can be thinking of preparing knight to d4 or knight to b4 after removing the bishop on d6. But he played king to h8. Now after queen e4, queen c7, queen to d5, b4. Where does white's bishop on c3 go? Lukas Dotzer, of course, doesn't go back to the passive square on d2, which would, for example, allow ideas like knight d4, but instead goes for the sacrifice. He goes for bishop takes g7 check, king takes g7, and now rook to e6. And white sacrificed just a piece for pawn. I mean, still he is, from material speaking, he has 2 pawns for the piece, but he has doubled pawns. But most importantly, black's king is quite weak. And white's position, in fact, here is already winning. But I found it very impressive how Dotzer managed to win the game. He found quite a few precise moves after that still. Rook 8 to d8, rook takes a6, now grabbing another pawn. There was no other way to defend the bishop on d6 apart from that. If rook f to d8, then another important defender is removed from the king side. Rook d8, rook takes a6, knight to e7, queen g5 check, knight g6, now queen takes queen h6 check. King g8, and now one of the moves which I found very nice was the move h4. White is not really in a lot of rush here. Black's position is very much paralyzed. Queen cannot move because the bishop on d6 is always hanging, and white is just using the time to push the pawn to h5, which removes the important defender on g6, the knight. Rook f7, h5, bishop f8, hitting the queen on h6, queen g5, bishop e7, and now precise calculation, knight to h6 first, king to f8, and now he vacated the g4 square for the queen. Rook to g7, h takes g6, and now it is quite a simple conversion. White already is a couple of pawns up, and still there's a lot of fire on the black king on f8. So a very impressive and nice game by Lukas Dotzer, who, as I said earlier, is now on a very nice trajectory to making a second GM norm in this tournament. Hopefully he will. Another game of Lukas Dotzer, which was actually played today, and I think it's the last game which we're going to see from now. So this was in the 5th round of the tournament, today in the morning round, and it featured another rook endgame. Borrmann with the white pieces, again, unfortunately having a pretty rough event so far. Hope he's going to be able to fight back in some of the remaining rounds. This was the rook endgame which we've seen here, and I guess almost everyone that was watching the game here assumed that it's going to end in a draw here. There's the same material here, and the only imbalance is that black has an outside passer. But as we all know, even some of the positions where black has an extra f-pawn still could be a draw if black's king is not too active just yet. But black does have some chances here because the king is already activated and white's king is still stuck on g1. So here rook a8 was played, a4. Lukas Dotzer, by the way, having the black pieces here, and Borrmann having the white pieces. Rook a5, already a good start because he's cutting off the king from the 5th rank. After g5, he goes for rook a6 check though, which surprised me a little bit. I would have gone for king g2, but still, after rook a6, it was a draw. It just invites black's king in. After that, it's still a draw, but then it requires a lot of precise calculation. I'm not sure what black's idea would have been after king g2. Maybe he didn't want to allow g4, trying to fix the structure like this. This could be one reason, but h5 still doesn't work because of rook takes h5, so this should be now a basic draw here. Still, black can run over with the king, and maybe this would be similar to the game after all then. So his move was also very logical, rook a6 check, because it does force black to either go back, after which black has no serious winning chances anymore, or to go to the front, after which white can take the pawn on h6. King to d4 now, and now it gets very sharp. Rook a6 back, king to c3, king g2, logical, bringing the king, and now king to b3. But now white needs to be quite careful. In the game, now Borrmann still found the right move, but after that, not the right follow-up. He started with h4, but after g takes h4, now he took back, and now black's position is already winning. I think one good way to continue here would have been f4, g takes f4, and now g4. And after a3, g5, now black doesn't even have those ideas with rook a4 anymore, because white can take and then go g6, and in the end is going to promote at the same time as black, and should not lose this anymore here. Should be a draw. So this would have been a nice chance for white. h4 was still okay, but after g takes h4, now he needed to go for f4. Again, with the idea after a3, he's in time with f5, and if rook a4, then he can take again, go f6, and in the end, it's going to be a draw like this. In the game, Borrmann took on h4, and after a3, king to g3, a2, he had to sacrifice the rook, otherwise rook a4 would come, and here white is just not in time with the pawns. The black king is coming back, and a couple of moves later, Borrmann had to throw in the towel here after rook b1. Rook g1 check is coming next, and then the king is going to be too far, too close to the white's pawns, and therefore black is winning. Another impressive endgame showing by Lukas Dotzer, who was fighting until the very end in this game and definitely was rewarded for that. So the final round is now still ongoing. I will actually go to the round in just after I finish recording this video, just trying to check out some of the games and maybe say hello to the players. Just as a quick, finish sentence of the whole video. I know that this is probably not the video you expected, but I still found it important for me to make a video on that, because it's a small milestone in my whole career, I would say. It's a thing which I've never done before, and I'm quite happy with the tournament I was able to put together. Of course, not only by myself. Again, I need to say a lot of good things for the Austrian Chess Federation here, of course, who is funding this event, and of course also to the chief arbiter Walter Kastner, who helped me a lot with for example, setting up the live boards, and he is the mastermind behind all of that, being there every day, all day long with the players, being an arbiter and checking that the live transmission is working well. So I'm only the person in the back here, and who invited the players and made sure that everything hopefully is going to work well. So still hope you guys enjoyed this video. It's very exciting for me to always watch the games. I'm always hoping for the Austrian players, of course, to perform well, to get some norms in this tournament. And I'm really happy that for Lukas Dotzer and for Peter Balint, especially at the moment, it is looking like they have serious chances to achieve that. Possibly also Valentin Badetsky, who might still have some chances for achieving his, I believe, final Grandmaster norm. Also quite close with him, definitely cheering for him too. So that was it for now. I will speak about the tournament again once it has concluded after 9 rounds. And until then, I will be cheering for the Austrian players, and I will also put a link into the description down below in case you want to do the same. Thank you guys for watching, and I'm going to see you guys soon.